Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of Tudor Place, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second program in our 2024 Landmark Lecture Series. Particularly want to extend a warm welcome to our Board President, Christy Picicaro, who's joining us this evening, as well as our Garden Party honoree, Tom Birch. So great to have both of you here this evening. We'll begin with our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Statement. We respectfully acknowledge the Anacostan and Piscataway people on whose ancestral homelands Tudor Place Historic House and Garden sits. We also celebrate the vibrant Native communities who make their homes in the DC area today. So the theme of our lecture series this year is historical remembrance, commemoration, and memorialization. And this offers us an opportunity to think about what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember these things as a reflection of our values and ideals at a given time. And this evening, we'll reflect upon how we are remembering an enslaved home space just a few yards away from us here at Tudor Place. So for over a decade, Dovetail Cultural Resources has been a partner with Tudor Place, using archaeology as a tool for documenting and understanding the full story, the whole story of this site. Beginning with their initial survey in 2010, Dovetail has conducted multiple investigations in the Orchard area, right out here in the North Garden, to substantiate initial discoveries that suggested this could be an enslaved home site. The artifacts recovered in May 2022 in this location are featured in our current historic house installation and tour, Ancestral Spaces. And if you've not had that tour experience or been through the house in the last few months, we certainly would encourage you to do that. There are some booklets over here on the mantle as well that give you additional information about Ancestral Spaces. So we're pleased to welcome this evening Dr. Kerri Barile Tambs, Dovetail's president and principal investigator. Kerri has over 30 years experience in the field of cultural resource management, archaeology, architectural history, and public outreach. She holds a BA degree in historic preservation from the University of Mary Washington, an MA in anthropology and museum management from the University of South Carolina, and a PhD in anthropology and architectural history from the University of Texas. Kerri was recently awarded the 2022 Enterprising Woman of the Year Award by, of course, Enterprising Woman magazine. So it's our great honor. Welcome, Kerri. Thanks.
Thank you. No, I love being here. This is one of my favorite places. And actually, Dovetail's first experience was actually 1 year earlier than our full survey. And if you notice, in 2009, we'll talk about this a little bit, but they were doing construction on the house to the north. And because it was originally Tudor Place property, they said, oh, we have dirt exposed. We have dirt exposed. Would you come up here and take a look at it? And we said, well, of course we will. And so that started it. And then from there, it just spurred into this amazing program that you all have sponsored here over the years. So we are absolutely honored to be a part of this, part of your family here at Tudor Place. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about what is archaeology, because it's one of those fields where everybody has seen something about it on TV, but a lot of people don't know how it actually works. And that is kind of the basis of what we're going to talk about today, how we know what we know. Right. So we see things in the ground, we pick things up, but how do you interpret that? And how do you know what things are? So let's start about what is archaeology, the things that we're going to be talking about this evening. Archaeology is where you actually look at the dirt to try to find evidence of how people in the past lived. You look at, this is both pre-contact period, so the Native Americans, as well as the historic people who lived in this area. When we dig, we look for three things: artifacts, features, and ecofacts. Now, most people have heard of an artifact, right? An artifact is that a portable piece that can come out of the ground, a piece of ceramic or a nail or a projectile point. That's an artifact. A feature is where someone actually modified the earth for a cultural purpose. It could be a foundation. You can't actually pick the foundation up, right? So it's not quite an artifact, but it's made of bricks, which are. But it tells you a lot about how the earth was changed for cultural purposes. And then the third thing is a little bit more nebulous. It's called an ecofact, and it's basically a natural material, but it has been modified by humans. So think about if we were digging around and we found some charred bits of corn, right? So that is a natural material, but we found it in a cultural context saying that humans might have consumed said corn that was carbonized. So those are the things that we look for. And one of the most important things about archaeology, especially since about the 1980s on, is that we really recognize that one of the beautiful things about archaeology is that our story can be inclusive. Written records are astounding and amazing, and they tell us so much about our past, but they do have some biases, right? And they do have some limitations. Archaeology is not. Archaeology and the things we touch and the things that people use and what they ate, we all leave something behind. And therefore, archaeology has this wonderful spot in our discoveries where, again, we can learn about every one of us. So archaeology people ask all the time, how do you know where to dig? So one of the themes that we're going to talk about here, and this is something we were just talking about, was he says he gets all the time. How do people know where the quarter was? How do you know where you were looking? And that's because of the archaeological process. You start really broad, and then you start narrowing it down. So archaeologists first do what's called a phase 1 survey. Now, a phase 1 survey is where you actually put little holes in the ground, and we're going to talk a lot more about this. And you put one in the ground, usually every about 25 to 50 feet. So it's systematic, it's science. And then all the earth that comes out of that hole, you dig it by hand, you put it through a screen, and you look for artifacts. You also, while you're digging, could look for a feature, right? If you have bricks or something popping out of the ground, that's going to show you if something occurred there in the past, pre-contact period or historic period. Once you identify that site, you say, okay, there's something here. You then go back and you open up a little bit bigger area. Usually they're squares that measure about 3 feet by 3 feet or 1 meter by 1 meter-ish size. You dig them in a square or a rectangle, and you dig them scientifically going down. And that's going to say, okay, do we have the soils? Are they intact or are they all jumbled up? Do we have a lot of artifacts? What's the potential for features? And that's going to give you a lot more about the information in the site. Now, the third phase, if you do find a really neat site that you want to expose, that's when you have these really big digs. These are the ones you see on the Discovery Channel and all these kind of fun places. And those are the data recoveries of the big digs. So this right here, for example, this is a data recovery of a kiln that we did just this past summer. It's up in Delaware, but you can see this burn mark. We are exposing a brick kiln that was actually related to our topic now I think about it. It was actually built by the Gibbs family, who were actually free Black living outside Dover. And they actually helped make the brick to build all of the Black-owned buildings in Dover pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. Interesting side note. But anyway, that is kind of the features that we look for as archaeologists. Archaeology is not. We don't dig dinosaurs. We don't loot. We look for metal detectors. And we really don't do that. My colleagues aren't that handsome. No offense to any of my colleagues. I love you all, whoever not deserving out there. All right. So let's move into Tudor Place, why we're here. So again, archival records, they're amazing, and they really are the foundation of which Tudor Place's knowledge has built. So this is obviously the 1856 map, and many of you have probably seen this. At one point, the Tudor Place was, of course, much larger than it is now. Now it's about the lower portion here. Here's the main house. Here's the drive. This we know now is a barn, and it shows some trees. That is a Tudor Place landscape that was shown on this historic document. Great information. Archaeology, as we're going to see, we're going to take this and we're going to change it up. We're going to kind of take it and go, this isn't the whole story. It's a much, much broad story, and we're really excited to tell it. So as he said, in 2010, that's when Dovetail came involved. We did this big survey we'll talk about. But that's not the first time archaeology has been done at Tudor Place. It actually has been done for about 20 years before in little bits and pieces. For example, when they went to put a new drain system at the main house, they did some digging around the foundation before they disturbed the soils as good stewards of the property. University of Maryland did a bunch of survey in 2009, including some work right around where we are right now before they put the parking lot in. And then this is the dig that Dovetail monitored here in 2009 at the building at 1680, just to the north of here, again, because it used to be Tudor Place property, and they sponsored these. Now, tonight we're going to talk about just a handful of digs, but again, I want to really commemorate them. I think at this point we've dug about 7 or 8 places, which is really wonderful. Okay, so this 2010 thing we talk about, this was, I think, a really big watershed in the moment of Tudor Place understanding what archaeology could do. After our 2009 dabble, they said, okay, we've never really known what we have here. We've never done this thing, the phase 1 survey. So that's what we did. So we established a grid across the entire property. This is a 25-foot grid. Every 25 feet, we dug a hole. And here's an example of what one of the holes looks like. It's about foot to 15 inches in diameter. They all went down about 2 feet in depth. Every one of them was recorded through written notes, photographs, measurements, soil color, texture. You do that to understand what you have. As you see, we mapped every single hole. So everything they see that in the red dot means we found artifacts. The blue means we did not. And there's a couple that were in walkways and things, and we weren't able to dig those. Now, what this allowed us to do was to really identify archaeological sites, right? So that's the whole point. We wanted to know where sites could be located, and this tool was amazing. So everything was screened. We collected over 800 artifacts, all telling us information. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. We took all this data, all the soils, the colors, the textures, the artifacts we found, and we put them into a computer program at the time called Surfer. What that does is it looks for densities of artifacts, and it can extrapolate where it thinks you're going to then find more. So it's really this neat program. So as you see, this is an example of what it did. So if you see how some areas have a lot more black lines and then other areas have very few, the areas where you see the most circles, for example, this is the architectural artifacts like here and here and here, that's where they extrapolated. They believe that that's where you're going to find even more. So it shows these densities of certain categories of artifacts, and it really helped us pinpoint areas of interest. So we found information in the field, but when you crunched it through this computer program, it really revealed some really key information. And what it told us off the bat is that there were 4 key areas of interest that we suggested we should go back to. The first one is one that is our subject tonight, and that's area 1, and we'll come back to that, which is over here. At the time, they called it the tennis lawn. Now it's known as the orchard. We found an incredible amount of personal artifacts out there, pipe stems, ceramics, and things like that over in that area. It was really kind of a dense cluster. We found a lot of cut nails, which shows that there's some sort of building. The second area was right on the side of the house over here. Again, a really dense batch of artifacts. A lot of ceramics came from there and other kinds of artifacts. Here, over in area 3, again, we found this big cluster. What was interesting here is we found a ton of architectural remains, a lot of brick, tons of brick, as well as some nails. And we said something's going on here. And the last one over here in the dell, we found a lot of personal artifacts, but that was a little bit later period. Those are more like the early 20th century. So those are the 4 areas we suggested that if archaeology were to continue, that those are the areas that could reveal more information. So we'll talk about areas 2 and 3 quickly, just to show you a little bit more information before I really dive into the crux of our discussion tonight. So in area 2, we actually went back in 2017. There was a project to redo the gazebo and some of the other outbuildings. So we came out and we did more shovel test pits, those holes in the ground. And we did test units. Again, those are the units at the phase 2 level to see what was here. So everywhere you see a red dot, that's where we did a shovel test pit. And the yellow squares are the units that we put in the ground. And this kind of shows you some of the things we were looking for. So here's one of our units, and we found a buried utility line. We actually think it was a 19th century utility line, which is kind of interesting. Maybe even early gas. We're not quite sure. And over here, as you can see, what we look for, which is the stratigraphy, the layers of the earth. And so you can kind of see how deep some of these deposits went over there. So we're pretty sure through this dig that we actually identified a laundry over there. We actually have historic images that show laundry. Yeah, I know. It comes together. Tons of buttons, with straight pins and the things that you would think would come from a laundry and people folding clothes and manipulating clothes. We found a lot of that. We also found things like several marbles, coins, a little bit of a pipe bowl. And this is pretty interesting. Anybody can tell what that is by chance? part of a glass syringe, we believe because we know that Dr. Peters, potentially operated out of this western part of the house at one point. That's what some of the information says. So again, you're starting to put the archaeology with the people and who live there and how things worked. And it would have looked a little different if you walked up Tudor Place today and you saw somebody's shirt hanging from the side of it, I think. But I think it really shows, again, people living in the house, which is kind of exciting. All right, let's talk a minute about Area 3. This is the area that I mentioned that was in the, we found a lot of architectural materials. And here's the garden in 1933, and you can see how lovely it is, and it's still lovely today. In 2011, they actually did a massive, massive project to replant the boxwood garden, and they actually took all the everything out, and it looked like that. Pretty different, and it was a wonderful opportunity to not get gardeners angry at us, and we could dig anywhere we wanted to. That's what we were talking about earlier. Archaeologists are hated by gardeners. We dig everything up. But this was a great opportunity. They said, we have like 2 days before the boxwoods come in. What can you do? And we said, we can do it. And we ran up here and we put several units in to see what we could find. We looked in the northern part of the flower knot. And that's where we found a huge, what's called a post hole. So buildings, when they're constructed, they would have posts at the corners in the middle to hold up the roof. And we found one that was enormous. It had to have been 1.5 feet diameter. It was huge. We think it was for a barn. So it would have been probably an antebellum barn. And that's one of the black dots that you saw on that 1856 map. That's the one other building you saw. So we did have pretty good evidence for that. The other thing we found when we were digging, so we wanted to look a little bit to the south, was we found an incredible amount of brick. So if you all can see, so this is the dirt, right? And at the bottom of the dirt, we found this. You see how red it is? And then when you start digging, we just took a little test window out. Look at how many bricks are in. It was literally just brick with just a little bit of dirt. And we're like, what is this? That we had to do with construction. We weren't sure. And then we found these two pieces. And then the executive director at the time, Leslie, came and gave us this photograph, which is the main house with all the stucco removed when they're doing repair. So what we actually think this was now, based on the recovery of brick and based on the artifacts we found, was that this was actually where they set things up, and there's a staging area to construct the main house. So as most folks know, the wings are actually here first. Then they built the part in the middle, and this is probably the deconstruction layer in the middle, when they kind of broke through. So it was really pretty exciting. Okay, now we're going to move on to the heart of our talk. And this is Area 1. Here's a couple of the maps from that 2010 survey. I just want to kind of show you what we were seeing. So antebellum period, the period before the Civil War, you can see how much was here. These dense clusters that we were seeing, there's a dense cluster there. Now look at this. Look at that dense cluster of personal artifacts. That would be everything from pipe stems, buttons, and anything that could possibly be used by a person, marbles, coins, and all those kind of things we've been showing. The amount that we found here was just incredible. And so that was something we were noting, and we said, okay, that there's something going on here. We really need to go back to this area and see what it is, because a lot of the ceramics were very coarse. So they weren't the very pretty refined porcelains and the things that you would see on the main table. They were definitely more coarse wares. And so something was happening here that didn't match what we were seeing other places. So this is what the garden looks like today, but I want to kind of bring you back and kind of envision what this area would have looked like in the time period we're talking, which is probably about 1820 to mid 1860s. So this is what it looks like today. This is the North Lawn in 1900. It's still a garden. It's still lovely. But I think what we sometimes kind of forget when driving around Georgetown today is that this was the kind of on the edge of the country, right? I mean, this was not what it showed today. And I love this image, which is our street in 1861, so I think you have to kind of, again, bring yourself back, right? This is what we're talking about. It's a landscape where you didn't have this beautiful, amazing garden. It was a work yard. It probably smelled a little bit. It was probably dirty, right? And so it was a very different area. But you first have to put that in your mind, right? That this is a utilitarian backyard. There were other buildings. There were places people lived. There were probably fences. There were other things going on in the backyard. There were probably privies. So with that in mind, we can then kind of look at it and really kind of decipher what we were finding. So in 2013, they called us back and they said, okay, this area is very intriguing. What do you have here? So we brought a crew out, and again, we did this phase 2, right? We knew we had something, so we'd gone through the phase 1. We were then doing the phase 2. And if you look at this map, you can see these squares. We dug 6 squares to try to figure out what we had. Again, everything was thoroughly documented. We went straight down the ground. This is a book where we actually looked at the soils to really understand exactly what was in there. We collected soil samples so we could do what's called flotation. You actually, when you take earth and you put it into a big barrel of water, to simplify things, anything that's been carbonized floats to the top. And you can kind of take it off and analyze what kind of seeds they had and those kind of things that you can't find with a naked eye. So we really try to do a thorough investigation to go, is this something we really need to look into more? So forgive this photo, I rotated it so they're the same direction, but this is the kind of thing that archaeologists look for. This is one of our units. This is unit 3, and this is what we first came across. And you guys see how this corner is a different color? This corner is a darker brown, and this is the background soil, we call it, which is that orangey color. So when you see something like this, you say something different happened here. There's a reason that that soil is darker than the soil around it. And it's not natural. It's because a human activity caused it that way. So we excavated that corner just to make sure we were correct. And indeed, you see, it just drops down. So this is the corner excavated. So you can kind of see what we're dealing with. And it's just perfectly straight line. Here's kind of a drawing we did of it. So again, you can see it's a perfectly straight line. and then on the bottom was this really dark, rich soil that had a lot of artifacts in it. And we said, this is a feature. This is a really important feature. This feature is probably associated with some historic people who lived in this area, or at least used this area for some sort of domestic use. The artifacts were really interesting. And then here's where it gets really cool. So we have this information saying something's happened here. And here's some of the artifacts that we found. We found pipe stems. We found a lot of this very coarse ware. And this here is this little teeny tiny bead. You can't use a single artifact to say what happened at a site. It's not appropriate. It's not appropriate to make what cast aspersion, just jump to conclusions based on one artifact. But what I can say is that over and over and over, archaeologists find greenish to green-blue beads on sites that were occupied by African Americans. It just happens, and they find them over and over and over again. So we found this, and again, we didn't want to go, got it. But you said this is adding more to our really interesting story here. And again, we found tons of this really coarse ware here. So we analyzed that ware because it was very interesting and very different. And we even took some microscopic cuts of it and tried to figure out what's going on here. This is a ware that they call colonoware. And colonoware is, again, we're just adding to our story, a ceramic ware. It's a very coarse ware that's made locally that we find regularly on sites that are occupied by enslaved individuals, especially. It was a ware that actually looks a lot like Native American ceramics because of the low firing temperature. It is a ware that was developed because they had to. It's a ware because they did not have the same access to goods that a lot of other people had. They had to do what they had to do. So between Virginia and especially North Carolina, South Carolina, we find it regularly and has a very distinctive body and a distinctive mark. And we found a piece of that here. We actually made sure to bring in experts on pre-contact ceramics. We actually showed it to other experts who specialize in Black history in Virginia. And we wanted to make sure what we had here. And we're pretty sure that's exactly what we found. So again, we're adding to our story, what's going on in this spot. And when we started telling this information, I think if I can speak for you guys at Tudor, I think it kind of rocked their world. Again, because you have lovely bucolic backyard. And you're like, no, there was probably a quarter right there. And there was a barn right there. And there was, and it just kind of changed the interpretation of how they started realizing the landscape would have functioned at the time. It was really interesting. The road would have come in this way versus that way. It's at one point earlier than that map I showed. And so, you probably would have even driven by it on your way to the house. So in 2022, they said, okay, we cannot leave this alone. We need to know evidence. We need more. Is this or is this not a quarter? So we went back in 2022 in the same area. So here we are again. So we are right here. And this is kind of what it looked like at the time, to go back and say, okay, we need more information. Let's see what we got. So We ended up putting a bunch more units in at the time. I think we put 8 more units in to try to figure out what was going on. So this area here, we actually hand stripped first. This is where the 2 units were from 2013 that had that feature. And so we said, okay, well, let's look around and see what more information we found. So we re-uncovered that. We looked at all these areas to try to figure out what we could see. So here's a bunch of the units as they were together. And again, remember what I was talking about features, how the soils will look different if someone did something. So if I point your eye to right here, and I point your eye to right here, and you see how it's all dark in the middle, that is what we call a subfloor pit or a root cellar. That is, again, another piece of our evidence that this would have been a quarter. Again, a lot of people had them. But again, archaeologically, the evidence is very obvious that these were very used very often on sites that were occupied by enslaved individuals, especially. So what is this thing we call a subfloor pit? They were below the floor, subfloor, often in front of a hearth, as this drawing kind of shows. Sometimes, like here, they would have been brick lined, and sometimes, like this one, they were just dug into the earth. This one was just dug into the earth. What does this mean? Why? Why were these things here? They put them here for many reasons. The first is that you used it to store many things. They would store anything from food waste to anything they held dear. It was in front of the fireplace to add just enough warmth so things didn't freeze. But subfloor pits are very important, especially in the enslaved experience, because they were a great way to have, they call it a hidden transcript, right? Hide things in plain sight. So if they were not allowed certain products, if they wanted to make sure something was theirs and theirs in their personal lives, they would put it here because it wasn't out in the open. The property wasn't theirs. Enslaved individuals had no agency. They were given no rights. So anybody could walk in as they wanted to. And this was the one dash of way that they could control their worldview and their material goods, was by putting it out of sight. So we find them very regularly on quarter sites. And that is what we're pretty sure we have out in the garden. So we have this pit, which is very indicative of getting a quarter. The artifacts, again, speak to exactly what we're talking about. It's really an incredible, vast amount of artifacts. Things you expect, like window glass, nails, right? We're expecting those kind of things to pop out of there. We have things like pipe stems, toothbrush, and these things that can really speak to people. This is a broken metal file down here, and animal bone, ceramics, what they ate off of. There's actually a prehistoric artifact kind of sitting in the middle. There's several of those here on the property as well. But the story starts coming together, right? So we're able to tell about their lives and who lived here. Our interpretation is that this could have been a multi-use building. It could have been used for laundry. It could have been used as a kitchen, but it almost definitely was used for a domestic habitation, probably by someone who's enslaved by the Peters family. We're scientists, so we had to do some more science. We ran soil chemistry. So this is where you take samples of soil and you actually submit them to a lab, and the lab comes back and tells you what minerals are in the soil. Again, all of our activities, everything we do, whether it's gardening to being a privy and everything in between, it leaves behind some chemical signature. And so this also is a great way for us to try to figure out how this area was used. And again, we got more data. So for all the non-chemists out there, right, we have all of our minerals up top, including potassium, and we had phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Those are the 4 that are most prominent on the sites. What this told us was that we actually had very little potassium, but we had very, very high rates of calcium and of phosphorus. So what this means to us is there was a lot of organic material out there. Mostly we had a ton of cut animal bones. You see the cut mark here, which again is a sign of food production and consumption. You also find a lot of like this very small pieces of bone on sites that were occupied by either free Black or enslaved individuals. Stews, foodways. If anybody knows much about African foodways, it was just again, they've proven it's a very big cultural product to take the bones and finely chop them and make them into stews. Again, it's also what they could get, right? it's the quality of meat. So very fragmented bone and oyster shell. So the chemical signature again matched the dietary intake of someone who would have been in this position, someone who may have had to forage for their food, I guess, and go out and get the shell, were maybe not given the meat that was high in the hog, and was probably not quite, eating the same thing that the Peters family might have consumed. But the soil chemistry absolutely proved that as well. So the other thing I think that was really great is a lot of people get, well, how do you date sites? Right? How do you know? And I wish every site had this on the very bottom of the feature when we sampled it. They left us a coin. Wasn't that nice of them? Isn't that great? There's an archaeological term called terminus post quem, which means date after which. That means that your feature can only date to after the latest dated artifact. So here we have a coin from 1863. We found it on the bottom of our sampling of the pit, which means the pit had to be filled in after 1863. And so that, again, is a really important mark landscape-wise because it says that this quarter stood through at least 1863. We think now probably by 1865, 1866 is when it actually came down. But then again, that has such a great piece of information to tell us about the landscape and what it would look like and how long that this feature would have been used. So quarters in urban areas. What do they have here? It is pretty unique. They have this perfectly intact archaeological evidence of a quarter. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it was a quarter. Archaeologists can never be 100% sure because we weren't there, but I'm pretty sure. But this is something that we see a lot, and archaeologists are now able to start researching things and finding more. Sometimes they would have been enslaved individuals would have been housed in the main house, basements, attics, at the foot of beds. Sometimes they would have been, the basement. Here's a good example, like where you worked, you slept. That's just kind of how we know from the records that occurred. We're also getting better at really digesting what the landscape looked like, but looking at things like historic maps. Now you have this little bitty dwelling behind a whole row of houses. And this is down in Fredericksburg, and I convinced them to let me dig. And it turned out, yes, indeed, this was a quarter. So there is evidence around. I think we're now just open to looking at things differently through a different filter and seeing what this evidence is telling us. And so I think over the years, we're going to start seeing more and more evidence of urban quarters. Here in DC, it's a little harder because land is so valuable that a lot of the area has been churned up and built on and developed. But we have some other areas that, maybe not as dense, where I think the evidence of the enslaved experience in urban areas can really be told so much more through archaeology. And people are just starting to really, really embrace that. And I think the next several years are going to be very exciting for that field and what we can tell about lives that heretofore we have not been able to. All right, so here at Tudor Place, let's look at this map again, right? We're missing a lot. All we have here is we have a house and we have a barn. Shows about the map maker a little bit, doesn't it? We have a quarter. We have a lot of other things that were going on in this yard, people's lives, the people who lived here, and things that archaeology can tell. There is a whole population, and I think anybody's explored Tudor Place on their webpage and the new exhibit, what they're doing is amazing and beautiful and needed. It's a needed story that needs to be told. And what I can say is that archaeology, we can start doing, adding even more. We have someone's toothbrush. I mean, that's a daily thing, right? That's a person. We have the pipe. We have ceramics that someone probably made, if not here, very locally. And we know what they ate. I mean, this is a story that is very rich and it's very, very exciting. And so we're very proud to have helped Tudor Place discover this very, very important part of their past. And maybe they'll let me come back and play someday and finish exploring. But again, the gardeners won't like that, but that's okay. That's just a piece of it. And we talked about maybe taking a walk if anybody wants to take a walk, but I'd love to answer any questions if I could. Yes.
I have two questions. Where do these things come from? You answered the one about the course, but I'm wondering also about those beads.
So the beads would have probably been purchased or traded. Especially in an urban environment, a lot of enslaved individuals have the opportunity to actually work elsewhere for pay, depending on who owned them, or I should say who enslaved them. They sometimes could keep the funds and purchase things on their own, and sometimes they were also given items too. So I honestly don't know enough about the Peters to know if they allowed individuals to work on their own. I know several other quarters I've worked for, people have done that, but I'm not sure exactly about Tudor Place.
So I guess, do we know if they were unique to communities?
You find beads pretty regularly. It's this color and size of bead that we do find very, I don't want to say regularly like every site, but what I'll say is when you find them, they often are on sites that were occupied by enslaved individuals. Yeah. Under, do you all know more about the activities and the actions of the Peters family? And I know that a lot of them lived off site, but were they allowed to work off site? Interesting. And so once in a while you have it, and it's really very, very interesting how that system worked.
Is the photograph in the center from the Tudor Place archive?
Yes.
Do we know who they are?
I think it was unidentified. You know who it is?
Do we know who the
Yeah, I'm sorry.
individuals
Thank
in
you.
the, photograph
See.
are? Okay.
Yeah, but they are indeed in the. She asked if in the Tudor Place archive, and it is. And I'm sorry. Did everybody hear the first two questions that were asked? I told you I'd forget to repeat it. Okay, good. Yes. Theoretically, yes, you could do it. Now, the challenge is identifying a descendant who you can tie it to. And so that would be a bigger case to try to identify the descendants of folks who were enslaved here and chasing them down and getting them to willingly donate their samples. Yes, you could. Yeah, yes, you could. There are things you absolutely could do. DNA is a very powerful tool. You can actually find some pretty amazing things. We used it a couple of years ago. Sidetrack, but I'll tell you because it's an interesting story. We dug up the remains of 3 Union soldiers in Fredericksburg a few years ago, one of which had died in battle, and he was buried with his coat. His coat was balled up and thrown with him. And no, it didn't actually look like a coat anymore. It looked like a ball of, we call it the wad. But within the wad of cloth, we found a bottle that actually had mercury in it. And so the individual had syphilis. So this poor 22-year-old was dying and of mercury poisoning and a bullet and syphilis all at the same time. But he had other things in his pocket. And so we were able to take these things and do some DNA sampling to try to figure out more about these individuals and, you know, who they were. And again, we couldn't concretely say, but we could narrow it down pretty well to who they were. So it is a tool, and it's not a cheap tool, but it's an interesting tool that could possibly be used on things like that in the future.
Kerri, at the beginning, you were talking about the bias that you find in the written record. How do archaeologists counter their own biases? And because there still is interpretation and analysis, there's a lot of science to it, but how would you address that?
That's a terrific question, and that's why the whole night you kept hearing me say could be, maybe, perhaps, because again, the question was, see, I told you you're gonna have to remind me, how do archaeologists recognize their own biases? And I will say it's cumulative data is part of it, and being open, and then also bringing in the descendant communities, and that's an enormous piece of this we haven't really talked much about tonight. Traditions, memories, interpretations, they're all important. So that is something I think that we all are getting better at, is involving descendant communities into our dialogues. From an archaeological perspective, it's, like I said, cumulative data. And that's why I kept saying things like, I don't want to say it is, but, right? So things like the blue bead, it just keeps happening. Things like the colonaware, it just keeps happening. So you might have a document that says, indeed, this was a quarter. When you find some things in there. Another one says, a document, this was a quarter. We find the same things here. Well, a third site, you don't have that document, but you're finding the same things there, right? So again, it's cumulative information. You rule out some things that could maybe not be true, but you really try to do an additive story to what we have. So again, that's why archaeologists rarely talk in absolutes, because again, we don't know, but we can infer a lot about these things. And then more importantly, I think it also takes a lot of openness and humility to recognize that the interpretations you might have today might not be the same in 2 years or 5 years, 10 years or 30 years. I mean, I can certainly say that we are revisiting things that were done in the 80s, the 60s, the 50s. I mean, that's what we do is, and then someone's going to look at this all again and maybe throw that out the window in 15, 20 years. I mean, I don't know, but you have to accept that we'll always be getting more knowledge and our story will always be getting more interesting and more nuanced and more informed as our technology improves. Yes.
Thank you so much for this. This is just so deeply important for Tudor Place
Mhm.
and for our neighborhood and for our telling of history in a fuller way. I don't know if you're involved at all in the dig that's happening right now on Q Street between Wisconsin and 34th, where there seems to be an African-American cemetery.
I'm not.
And one thing I was wondering related to that, so I live in a house on Dumbarton Street that used to be a store. And my husband today went to the Peabody Library to look up archival documents about the house, and there's very little except for the wealthy French
Yes.
financier, who is the third Frenchman to live in the house, to my knowledge. My husband is also French. Only quite, the obituaries of very fancy people who inhabited that place, and then nothing from before. So I was listening to you and thinking, if we ever were to dig in my backyard, knowing that it was a store, how does one go about this type of work? What's the financing in terms of getting someone like you involved, and how did that work here at Tudor Place, and how does that work for residents?
Mhm.
Probably a lot of us in this neighborhood we're sitting on history.
It's a phenomenal question. And if everybody asked, she was asking about how you go about sponsoring or acknowledging the archaeology and how often around and how Tudor Place got involved in this. It was first involved through donations is how we got involved here. And then again, continued donations and grants is how they paid for the archaeological services. Now, there are various folks who do archaeology. You could look at places like universities, right? Now they're booked. But, everybody wants free or cheap labor. That's natural. There's usually great opportunities for students to learn, but they don't have a lot of capacity and they have limited amount of time. So that is definitely the least expensive way to go, but it'll take the most time. There are also some nonprofit groups who do it, but again, something similar. They're kind of like in the middle, that they're probably the middle range cost wise. But again, you might have trouble acquiring their services because it's such a unique field for people to get into. A third way would be to hire folks from a company like mine, which is a private company. What we do as my company is we always have, we'll call it, I don't know how I phrase this properly. We always like to give folks like our friends at Tudor Place a break. It's the right thing to do. Right. And so, for example, there's been more than once where I've taken my vacation time and gone and done it because I think it's the right thing to do. I'm, of course, going to pay the staff. But there's a balance, right, of what we got to find. So as far as the cost goes, it just depends on the size of the area you want excavated, the extent of the documentation. So you could go dig and do document as an archaeological site and maybe do a pretty nice but decent letter report, say, for example, versus a big chunky tome. There are ways you could do it and phase it to get work done and have the costs range. And the cost for archaeology can range anywhere from a few $1,000s up to a few $100,000, depending on the area you want excavated. I mean, those big, huge data recoveries, we're there for months at a time with crews of 6, 8, 10 people. That's just a lot of mouths to feed. So it's not even that, I have a second home in the Bahamas or something. It's just that, there are people who all have advanced degree. Everybody has at least a bachelor's. There are minimal qualifications to be a qualified archaeologist, and to be just a basic technician, you have to have a degree in archaeology in a field school. To run a dig, you have to have minimum of a master's degree. To be a principal investigator, you have to have even more experience beyond that. So these are folks who know what they're doing. So you also need to pay them as well for that. So that's a great question. And then so your question as far as where to get the money to do this, there are some grants out there. Especially if you think that you might have something related to any more the disenfranchised communities of any disenfranchised community, whether it's someone who's enslaved to a woman, to an Asian immigrant. I mean, these are stories we need to tell, and they recognize that archaeology is one of the better ways to do it. Right. So there are more grants that are dedicated to that right now because of the paucity of the written record. It's not saying that everyone's story is not important. It's just that we're finding ways that we can fill in the holes this way. So there are other grants out there. There are other funding mechanisms to help support archaeology that way too. Mhm. Yes, I'll repeat it.
You mentioned the technology advances in recent years
Mhm.
in archaeology. Can you talk about some of those are? I wasn't aware of any.
Yeah, so he asked about technology in archaeology and what it could show. The one that a lot of people have heard of course, is ground penetrating radar. I think most people in this room probably have heard of GPR. Ground penetrating radar is where you actually take a device and it shoots waves into the ground and it shoots it back at certain frequencies, and it can tell if something happened below the ground without digging. Now, the good thing about ground penetrating radar is that you don't have to disturb any earth, right? You don't have to dig up plants or dig in anything. The hard thing about ground penetrating radar is it doesn't tell you what you have. So we were just talking about here in Tudor Place, and could you use ground penetrating radar to try to find the extent of the quarter? And the answer is maybe. The problem is you have a garden, right? You have an active garden. A post hole is a round hole with sometimes small holes around it. Well, what's a tree hole going to look like? The exact same thing. So trying to differentiate in data might be very clear or it might not be, and it's not cheap. So it's not an exact science. However, it's a very useful tool. We do have things that we talked about, things for the artifacts themselves. We're also using LiDAR more, light detection. I'll get up the acronym later. LiDAR is basically looking at the topography from various. Do you know what LiDAR stands for? You're looking. Yeah. Oh, I know, Leslie. I know. I do looking in the background. I just like looking at you. But yeah, it's basically they can use some really incredible satellite and the data to look at. This is where you ever hear the stories about how they find like roads in the Amazon and things. That's what LiDAR is where they actually can take the vegetation and they can actually expose the earth basically graphically to look at things. So LiDAR is really, very cool. Yes, Leslie's the one who gave me the amazing photo of the bricks. So I can finally call you out without in the middle of talk. Yeah, so those are other ways. We also can, of course, things like carbon-14. If you want to date things that are older, you can start doing that. There's potassium argon dating. So there's a lot of those kind of things you can do with soils and artifacts that we're just now really starting to get into. And I guarantee you that there's so much more that we have barely touched the surface now that we're really starting to have better technology to explore.
You spoke about the laundry yard
Mhm.
early on, and I'm just wondering if your initial investigations located any of the possible site of the original kitchen.
So there is some evidence. We found a lot of charred material actually over there. We found a lot of charcoal in that area. We found again kind of more the coarse wares, some utilitarian wares over there, and that's why we're actually not 100% sure about the quarter. If the quarter also go to some place where they would have prepared food because the artifacts we found in it, it could have been used as a secondary kitchen-like area. Yes. But no, we didn't find like an intact hearth or something like that. I'm sorry, I did it again, didn't I? He asked if that was a kitchen was over there. Told you I'm the worst.
Thank you, Kerri.
Yes.
Please don't run off. We're going to open the door and go out and explore in the garden a little bit. Before we do that, I want to just mention a couple of things. One, there's a question about how are these things funded, and I do want to acknowledge the Stewart Foundation for their support for this recent archaeological investigation. So they've been very supportive of many activities that we've done here, particularly in the garden. So I want to thank them for that. Also want to say hello to my predecessor, Leslie Bueller, who's joined us tonight. Thank you for being here. Leslie was, I think, the person responsible for launching all of this and really beginning this relationship with Dovetail. So thank you for that and all of the many other things that you did in your 15 years here. Want to just point out a few things that are coming up on our schedule in the next few weeks. Our next tutor nights will be on Thursday, May 2nd. The theme is Up in Arms, a Family Service, and it will be exploring the experience of Peter family members who served in 5 wars, from the War of 1812 to the World Wars. And this event, as always, with our tutor nights, includes a lovely cocktail and hors d'oeuvres here at the Dower House after you've seen the exhibit in the main house. Our next landmark lecture will be Tuesday, May 14th, and will feature our own Rob DeHart, our curator, and Jana Recco, our collections manager, who will be speaking about one of the strangest and most interesting items in the Tudor Place collection, an 18th century diorama of miniature wax sculptures created by Samuel Francis of New York and given to Martha Washington in its gift to her in 1783. So hope that you will join that. I hope I've been mysterious enough about that it will pique your interest. Not only the history of the artifact itself as this gift to Martha Washington, but the journey, the conservation journey that we have been on as an organization. And the program cleverly is entitled Wax Nostalgic. So hopefully that will get you here. Also want to extend again an invitation to everybody to have the Ancestral Spaces experience. This is a special installation and tour that we're doing in the historic house. We've extended it now through October 13th to provide more people an opportunity to do that. I want to acknowledge several of our docents are here this evening. Thank you so much for the service that you do. There is a booklet with information about that over here on the mantle. So we hope to see you again at one of these events or activities that are coming up in the near future. Thank you again, Kerri, very much for that. Want to extend thanks again to Jana and Rob and Amy, who I guess has locked herself out. She's on the front porch or something, for all of their assistance with the lecture series. And so we'll call it a night in here, but let's head out to the garden and take a look at the site we've been talking about.